I have done a number of solitary retreats. I did one up in Smuggler's Notch in a tent for 3 months. At this time of year, January, February, March, I was up at the top of Mount Mansfield. And there was a stream there, a stream that came down from the top of the mountain, amazing. I had to make a culvert to go under Route 108, under the road, goes through the notch. And that stream came down and made amazing ice formations and made a beautiful sound all through the winter. It never froze. I called it the stream that never froze. It meant a lot to me. Somehow it never froze. It was cold up there. It was very cold. -30, -40. That's quite cold. You'd think that this little stream would freeze, but it never froze. Always singing its little song. Making huge ice formations as it found its way down the mountain. And I also trained in the Himalayas, and there I was also right near a stream, which was good because I needed water. That stream sort of froze. We meaning the monks, we would have certain places along it where it would keep the ice broken. But somehow the way that it flowed, I don't know why this happened. I can't explain how this happened. Like so much of what happens outside of cultures where we greatly value explaining things. Much happens that you can't explain if you don't base the whole world on explaining things. And far more than happened in this culture, believe me. Around here we explain things, and we can explain things. But elsewhere, things happen that are very mysterious. The physical laws that we believe in so deeply seem to be based on those beliefs. If you don't believe in them, somehow things change. But this, I'm not claiming it's about the sort of things that I saw the monks do. This isn't about that. This is just a stream. The stream flowed down the mountain. And somehow, in a way that I can't explain, that probably isn't due to supernatural power, the stream also made incredible ice formations. I don't know how a stream flowed over itself, but it would seem to freeze and then it would flow over the frozen part and create incredible structures of ice as it went down the mountain. But it just kept flowing for the whole winter down that mountain from the stream, from the spring, from the top of the mountain, way, way up high. Not the top, but you know, however high it was, 18,000 feet or whatever. It just kept flowing down. And I, myself, I did not make it do that. I didn't make it do that. I didn't have a fight with it. I didn't bargain with it. I didn't plead with it. It just kept on flowing down the mountain, as if that was the natural direction for it to flow, as if it didn't have to decide, as if it didn't have to think it out and conclude, up or down. Well, perhaps down, for today anyway. It didn't seem to go through that process. It just flowed down, and it kept on flowing down. Well, I may, assuming that nothing particularly impermanent, markedly impermanent happens in the next several days, I suppose I will do another retreat here. And while the stream up there next to that cabin seems to have frozen, I can't see it anymore. It goes into the pond up there. There is a stream on the path that one might walk that's also frozen, yes, but it has particular significance to this community. We dug it. We dug a ditch, a gully, along that path because it was so muddy. Because we have so much water here that flows off of these mountains, always down. It's amazing how it just keeps flowing down, 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 down through our property. It makes the ground quite wet. So we dug a ditch in order to keep the path dry. Only you were here for that? You weren't here for that? How sad. How sad. Well, I have one witness that this really happened. So we dug a ditch. It was a lot of work. I think we did a fine job. But it was very interesting to me as we dug that ditch that we, as a community, had the belief, the firm belief actually, that we demonstrated repeatedly. We were willing to base our hard work on this belief. The belief that if it's convenient for us, then at times the water will flow uphill. And we would dig the ditch going uphill sometimes. Because, after all, it would be convenient for the water to understand that at this time, uphill is the direction in which it should flow. And I have the sense that some people, having put in that hard work, in the firm belief that the water will flow uphill, may have stood next to that stream and pleaded, "Will you please go uphill? Because otherwise I'm going to have to dig this ditch again. And if you would just flow uphill this once, in this one spot, I can make a sign for you if you need it, then I won't have to dig the ditch again. Uphill is the way to go this time. Over there you can go downhill again. It's only a few meters, just a short distance, just from here to there. It's no big deal. I'm sure you'll understand." Well, it didn't understand. The stream wouldn't flow uphill. And so we would look at that spot, we would have a conversation about it, we would consider that perhaps natural law was more important in this case than human convenience. And so we should submit to the natural direction that water flows in and dig the ditch differently. And then we would find that while we saw clear evidence that water flows downhill the day before, the next day, again, we'd give it another try, just in case. Is this all true? Yes, okay. And strangely, Even though we were giving that water a second chance, it hadn't learned its lesson. And neither had we. And so, we would have to dig the ditch again in a different way. This happened again and again. This metaphor, the Buddha finishes his talk with, is quite extraordinary. Bhikkhu Bodhi, who translated this, has said that if you ever start doubting if the Buddha was really enlightened, look at the brilliance of his metaphors, because no normal human being could come up with metaphors this good. They're just too good. There has to be some kind of superhuman knowledge at work here. So let's take a look at this. Just as when rain pours down in thick droplets on a mountaintop, the water flows down along the slope. You see, this is already brilliant. We haven't even gotten to the heart of it, and it's already so impressive in terms of what his meaning is in this text. The water flows down along the slope. It does. It's amazing. I know it seems as if we have to convince the water to go up the slope so that it can get to the ocean. I know it feels that way to us. But we don't have to do it that way. The water can flow down along the slope. And that's how it gets to the ocean. The water flows down along the slope. And it fills the cleft gullies and creeks. So naturally the water goes in a certain direction. It goes down. And it fills things. It fills things. In the same way, we move through experience from ignorance to craving. Ignorance, patterning, consciousness, name and form. All of this emerges naturally. We don't have to force it to happen. It just emerges naturally. We think maybe that we have to fight against it. To say, stop it. Stop it, nature. Stop it, my own true nature. And we base our practice on fighting against our own nature. We believe this time the water will flow uphill. I'm going to compel myself, in this case, to act against my own true nature and get the water to flow uphill. It won't happen. We can try to fight against ourselves. It won't work. Instead of that, we can observe as it fills the cleft gullies and creeks. It fills them. It fills consciousness. Consciousness becomes full. When consciousness is full, name and form automatically emerges. Automatically. When name and form is full, the senses automatically emerge. It's amazing. Just automatically. As Master Rinzai said, the one light divides into 6 rays. It's one light of consciousness divides into 6 rays, automatically. And we continue on through feeling, craving. And these creeks, these gullies being full, fill up the pools. And these fill up the lakes. These being full, fill up the streams. These being full, fill up the rivers. These being full, fill up the great ocean. Now, I should mention that it's interesting that the pools and the lakes are in this. Isn't that fascinating? Why would the pools and the lakes be in this? Is that really how it works? As we all know, not every river leads to the ocean. Some of them lead to lakes and stop. What is that all about? Because we can get stuck. We can get stuck in rebirth. We can get stuck in existence. We can get stuck in suffering. And yet naturally, just naturally, that suffering becomes clear to us. That just happens naturally. It's incredible. We just get born. It's amazing. Once all the conditions are appropriate for existence, for becoming, we're born into this life, this particular life, this one, where you're sitting in a room on a wooden floor that you haven't ever noticed. This life, where you have certain parents and certain influences, certain culture, certain education, certain wealth, certain friends. Here we are. This doesn't always seem apparent to us. A lot of the time we feel like this is just overwhelming. This amount of suffering is overwhelming. We get confused by it. Here I am in this life, but there's so much suffering. We can't see it clearly. And then we get stuck. And because we're stuck, all we see is this little piece of things. And so we make all kinds of weird assumptions, like somehow this life just appeared out of nowhere and is going to go nowhere. Despite the fact that every experience we've ever had tells us that consciousness, our life, comes from somewhere. Today came from yesterday. It didn't emerge without conditions. But we still make absurd assumptions because we are confused by suffering. We're incapacitated by pain. If the suffering that we see is faced, if we face it, then yes, I understand. It feels like it will drive you insane. I understand that. And so what's our solution to feeling like our suffering, if we face it, will drive us insane? We go insane. That's what we do. We cover over all of our perception with insanity, with stories that are empty, meaningless. And we get stuck in these pools and lakes. And we're fighting against the natural flow of suffering. The natural flow of suffering is faith, but we fight it. We get stuck in this suffering. We get stuck in life and death. And so we ignore the fact that life, birth, and death are obviously of the same nature. Being born is exactly the same nature as dying. And as we say, if A equals A, then A equals A. Very complicated logic for people who are incapacitated by pain, confused by suffering. But if birth has the same nature as death, then death has the same nature as birth. And we can get stuck in this endless cycle, and we don't want to face how significant that is because we want an easy escape. And what's so confusing is that the escape is easier than what we think. To us, the escape goes something like watch a TV show. Right? That's how we solve the suffering. We literally, I'll get to the figurative in a moment, but we literally watch a TV show. We're having suffering, we're not fulfilled, we don't feel connected, we don't feel we have people we can trust or love or who love us. We're living a life that we don't believe in, run by a culture that has lost our trust. We see what's happening in the world, we have no hope for the future, and so we literally watch a TV show. And we feel better. We try that. And what happens next? Well, we can get stuck there, yes. But if we can pay attention, if we can allow suffering to run its course, if we can face it, if we can be mindful of it, if we can accept it, if we can see it as what it is, then we'll note that there's no one there. There's no one there. You're watching the TV show. And not only is it the case that those actors aren't really the people they're acting like, so there's no one there, but actually there's no one there. You can look behind the screen. There's no one there. It's entirely delusional. It's a screen. There's no one there. They're not really suffering. They're not really having arguments. There's no one there. They're not arguing with each other. I know it seems that there's someone there. You're watching them, aren't you? You're watching people argue, fall in love, get hired and fired. You're watching all this stuff happen, and yet you must acknowledge that there's no one there. It's confusing, isn't it? And for human beings, anyway, it's confusing. This is not confusing. But to us, it's confusing. This is kind of our thing. This is the human thing. Get confused about things that are utterly obvious. Not confusing at all. It really seems to us as if there's someone there. There's a storyline. Stuff's happening. It seems that way. And yet, there isn't. And we have to accept then at the end of the half an hour or the hour that show ends. It ends. And even if there's another episode that you can watch right away, eventually the whole series ends. It's just over. So there's really no one there. And what's so amazing is that what you should do then is watch it again. Because you'll see that time there's no one there. This is boring. And you watch it again. You could watch it a third time, or a 12th time, or a 100th time. You can just watch the same minute. It'll only take you an hour and a half. Watch it again and again, and you'll see this is just light coming out of a screen. This is boring and meaningless. And you'll see that. And then maybe you'll gain the faith that there might be a world beyond that screen. Maybe. Who knows? But I could try looking somewhere else than at this screen. I could try it. Maybe I'll watch this minute one more time. But eventually, we might be willing to look somewhere other than that screen. And we'll see, oh, there is a world beyond this. So this also is a metaphor. But when we really face the significance of this metaphor, it's much more frightening than the funny metaphor about the TV show. Because we realize, in a way that can tear your mind to shreds, that our own life has just the same nature. It's just made up. We're having arguments with this person, we're succeeding at that thing, we're failing at that other thing, and we're agreeing with that other person. And it's all just made up. We're all agreeing to play along in this play that's been made up. We made it up together. We agreed. This is the human thing. We come up with ways of agreeing to be deluded together. We support each other in that delusion. We trap each other in that delusion, and then we use that delusion to go against the natural flow of suffering. The natural flow of suffering is that it's terrible, and you want out. It has to be ended. Anyone who realizes suffering realizes that the significance of suffering is that it is to be ended. It is to be resolved. That's the first noble truth. We experience suffering enough to know that suffering is to be resolved. That's the point. Suffering is the first noble truth. Just be aware, the Buddha could have taught anything, okay? Could have taught anything. I acknowledge it wasn't exactly the first thing that he taught, but it was very early on that he taught the Four Noble Truths, and the first of them is suffering. Realize suffering. That is your first job on this path. Each of the Four Noble Truths has an action associated with it. The action associated with the first Noble Truth of dukkha is realize it. Realize suffering. We block ourselves in, like the banks of a lake. We block ourselves in and get ourselves stuck in suffering by trying to guard ourselves from it. And yet, we can't escape because the nature of suffering remains. And like that pond up there, near that cabin, there actually is an outflow. And we are the lucky ones lucky parts of the water that got to go out of that culvert. What does that mean? It means that we acknowledge that the nature of suffering is to deposit us, to free us, through faith. And I have to say, I've said this a lot, but I'll say it again. I look back on my life, and I've had this thought again and again in the monasteries. I look back on my life and I have to ask, and I have never been able to answer, why me? I know a lot of people who are better than me, who are smarter than me, who are more competent than me, and they didn't get out. Why am I the lucky one? And I hope that you feel that way to a certain extent. Partially because it's valid and you should be grateful, but also because with that comes a deep commitment to service. And that service depends on completing what we've begun. Completing it, fulfilling it. And so we see that these pools being full fill up the lakes. This is all about filling things up. And those of you who have walked this path, who know this path well, understand the significance of talking about things becoming full, things becoming complete. That's what's needed. Things become complete. Things become full. It's just natural that when craving becomes full, it results in clinging. That's just natural. It's just natural that clinging, when it becomes full, results in becoming. It's just natural that becoming, when it becomes full, results in birth. It's just natural that birth, when it becomes full, results in death. That's just natural. And it's just natural that suffering, when it becomes full, results in faith. It just becomes full and full and full. There's a sense of fullness. And when that faith becomes full, it naturally becomes gladness. What does it mean for faith to become full? It means that you realize that this whole time you've been brainwashed. You've been indoctrinated. You've been deluded. And the direct experience of it is that you suffer, then you have faith that there's a way out, and it's by doing something different from what I did to get here. Believing in my thoughts and my feelings, all of that stuff, all of these modern worldviews, it hasn't worked. People talk about trying to change society, but they don't understand the source of society. The source of society, that's why it's so important that we understand dependent origination. You have to understand causality. It's frustrating to me that human beings have such a hard time with causality. We have a really hard time with it. Seeing results, seeing causes, seeing that. It's very difficult for us. It's such a gift that the Buddha, who was just a person, like all of us, just some guy, that he stated so clearly, when this is, that comes to be. When this is not, that does not come to be. An extraordinary teaching to make something so subtle as dependent origination accessible to other people. Can we really hear that? The significance of that. If we hear just that, if we hear when there is this, that arises. When there is not this, that does not arise. If we hear that, that is stream entry. Just hearing that is stream entry. And furthermore, if we didn't just experience stream entry, we didn't just hear that. That is the Dharma. But we have a very hard time seeing that causality functions. And furthermore, how it functions. And so we look at this world and we think, well, people just act this way, who knows why. The reason we act this way is because of the specific ways in which we mutually delude ourselves. This process of mutual delusion naturally results, just naturally, when enough people look at things in a certain way, a culture naturally forms. That culture naturally does things that don't make sense. Because it's based on a delusion. It's made up. It's mentally fabricated. And if we want to change the way human beings behave, we have to change the mutual delusional process. And if you want to change that, you must escape from it. You can't do it otherwise. Don't pretend. You can just convince water to go uphill. If your mind, if your perception is based on, is constantly subtly serving specific forms of delusion, your actions will necessarily follow that. If there's anything that we can learn by meditating, it's how little power we actually have over our own minds. And how much power our minds have over our actions. We have to train our minds, free our minds, actually free. That's exactly what you're doing. You sit here and you realize that this hasn't worked. There must be a way beyond it. With that moment, we can spring forth. That springing forth results naturally, when it is fulfilled, in gladness. And at that point, for the first time, we have a completely different compass from what we've always had before. And we see for the first time that up until then, we were just playing out patterns passed on through our genes, through what we've learned, on and on. We're just playing out patterns. And this, for the first time, is a direct experience. We directly experienced gladness. That is a way that we can follow. Because of that, we're amazed and we enter rapture. It's just a natural process. And it's important to see that from this point forward, each next step just gets better and better. It just gets better and better. We see this given in the metaphor of these being full, the lakes being full. Once the lakes are full, that doesn't mean we try to create suffering. It means that we face the suffering as it is. It does not mean we create suffering. The Buddha never recommended creating suffering. He said clearly, do not create suffering even for one moment. I do not recommend suffering for even one moment, he said. But we face the suffering as it is, rather than constantly trying to block ourselves off of it, away from it with delusion. We face it. We just face it. We don't try to create it. You don't have to create it. There's plenty. You don't need more in order to face it. Just face it as it is. See it as it is. Seeing it as it is, fully, so it fills you, there's faith that there is a way beyond. There is a way beyond. Then we experience directly a gladness that we were never told to experience. Don't worry that I just said it. It will have no impact at this moment. You will have forgotten it. It won't matter. These are just words, as all of you know. You know how effective these talks are. They don't impact you very much at all. So don't worry about it. That experience will impact you. Oh, this gladness is real. It was completely unplanned. As Jesus of Nazareth said, the kingdom of heaven comes when you do not expect it. You won't expect anything. It's just faith. And then you realize that when you experience the gladness, that the compass you've been using was this other thing, not faith. It was blind faith, as we call it. We just trusted what our thoughts were saying without any questioning. We just trusted our feelings. Why? We never wondered. We just believed. This is definitely the way out. But now we have a direct experience. That gladness naturally becomes rapture and on until we fill up the great ocean. That means awakening. See how it is that this faith becomes gladness, becomes rapture, becomes tranquility, becomes happiness. Each next stage is better than the last. And it happens automatically. With each one becoming full, the next one is even better. It's even better. Until finally, with happiness, we finally have the basis for Samadhi. Yes, we need to have a sense of urgency, absolutely. But know that happiness is the basis of Samadhi. Find your way to true fulfillment. And it will become automatic to enter Samadhi. This Samadhi results in the knowledge and vision of things as they really are. Which is a magnificent phrase, yatha bhuta jnana dasana. Just a magnificent phrase. Yatha means really, means truly. Bhuta, things. Jnana, knowledge. Dasana, vision. And what is the knowledge and vision of things as they really are? It's just the same thing that we were observing when we were experiencing true suffering. That's it. That suffering was the direct realization of total impermanence. That there's nowhere you can get a foothold. There's no safe place where you can take a break. And furthermore, there's no one in there who can control the situation. It's an absolutely terrifying experience as long as we're experiencing it with clinging to self. Utterly terrifying. And I happen to know that there are few people in this room who know this experience. Maybe more. But I know there are few people who know that it's so overwhelming that it feels likely that it will snap your mind. if you were to let it become full. But this knowledge and vision of things as they really are is directly perceiving exactly that same thing. And yet, I just said that each next step here is better than the last. How can the knowledge and vision of things as they really are, that being seeing that things are totally untrustworthy, totally not dependable, how could that be even better than the bliss of Samadhi, which is even better than the fulfillment of happiness, of true happiness? This means real happiness. Better than tranquility? How's that possible? Because now we're seeing it from the perspective of Samadhi, without fighting with it, without the awareness that we're fighting against something that we cannot win against. There isn't even someone here who could win, because the person who's fighting is somehow the same thing as what's being fought against, and yet there's just a fight. That is our experience until we can directly perceive it through Samadhi. But it is our experience. We still see this is worthless, and so there's revulsion. And revulsion is enormously empowering. It's just revulsion. Just, oh, well then, never mind. This is terrible. An incredible confidence has come now that we could truly transcend the world, and with that comes what's called here dispassion, viraga, letting go. Truly letting go. This happens through being filled and filled. Our body becomes full. Each next experience becomes full, 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 full. And this letting go lasts for one moment, and there is liberation. Then, with the knowledge of destruction, you could say, new life begins, if you want to put it that way. This all happens naturally. We don't have to fight against it. Of course, there should be a sense of urgency, but that doesn't mean that we're trying to force something. On the contrary, just because we're here doing this together, we're automatically being drawn on. I've said to a number of you that this path is just much bigger than what you're talking about. I know how important the things that you're worried about seem, but this path is so much bigger than that, that you don't really need to worry so much about the things you're worried about. I know it seems like they're really important, but if you were to stop worrying, you would do all the same stuff anyway. So why not stop worrying? It's going to be fine. You just keep going. You're doing this now. You're in this retreat. You're doing a technique. You're just going to move on. It's just going to keep happening. You're going to find your way down this stream, pond, river. You're just going to find your way down it. Just keep going. You don't need to rush it. You don't need to force it. You don't need to resist it. You don't need to stop it. You find your way down the river. If you just stick around being influenced by these people who care about you, automatically we find our way. This is deep faith, that nirvana isn't something you have to create. On the contrary, nirvana is that which is not created. And all the things we've created automatically fall apart. The question is that process filling us? Are we being filled directly by that experience, by this experience? so that this experience happens completely, so that it can be finished, so that there can be the cessation of perception, feeling, consciousness, the cessation of sanskaras, the knowledge of destruction of ignorance. This happens because each next experience becomes more and more full. So give yourself totally to this. Give yourself totally to this direct experience. And take advantage of the precious opportunity that we have been given.